About a year ago, I bought this 225 Quattro from a local dealer. Back then, I didn't have a YouTube channel, and I had no idea how far I would end up taking this car as a project. I bought the car, drove to Harbor Freight, and bought a boost gauge just to purely check the health of the engine. Installing it with zip ties back then, it was function over form. Things are different now. In my quest to make this car a better version of itself, I want form and function. That means the zip ties and the Harbor Freight boost gauge, while functional, aren't going to cut it. It's time to upgrade. I know the boost gauge is going to be functional, but I want to make sure that it doesn't contradict the Bauhaus styling that makes the interior such a fun place to be. This is a genuine OSIR part that mounts boost gauges on a car. You may be wondering why I didn't give you the actual part name. Well, it's not exactly a part that's designed for the TT. It's actually designed for an A3 of a completely different generation. So I'm taking a gamble on whether I can make this fit. But I think if we can pull it off, it's not only going to improve the look of the interior by removing the total number of zip ties holding things in place, but it's going to follow the design principles that are already existing in the car and leave all of my air vents functional and uncluttered. I'm going with all black gauges so that it closely matches the plastic that's already on the interior. OSIR actually made a very similar part for the actual Mark 1 TT, however that has been long out of production. It was an incredibly limited run to begin with, and you can't find it anywhere online. So I'm taking a gamble with this and going based on looks alone as to whether I think it'll fit. This version for an A3 is for sale currently, and if it fits, it may be one of the best ways to mount a boost gauge to stay in the tradition of the TT's interior. I'm not a huge fan of deleting air vents to fill a gauge because I use them regularly. However, I never use the ashtray, so I decided to look for ways to get it to mount down there. We're in the S4 currently, on our way to the auto parts store, getting ready to install the boost gauge on the TT. We need a few things, so I figured we'd go on a little journey beforehand. Like normally happened, I bought a lot more than I needed to, but oh well, we'll use it. At the auto parts store, I picked up a whole number of things, most of which were just random tools I thought would be useful when mounting this gauge pod. Extra wires, connectors, and everything of the sort that we'll need to install this boost gauge. Now, this car already has a boost gauge installed, and the vacuum line running to the engine has already been put in place. I'm not going to be replacing this line, but I am going to be taking it apart and showing you where it goes and how I decided to route mine in case you're wondering how you want to route yours. There's a number of ways you can route gauges on this car, and this is probably not the most efficient, but it was really easy to do. Boost gauges measure vacuum and boost for turbocharged cars. We need a vacuum source from the engine bay to actually measure, otherwise it's not going to tell us anything important. Just like the routing for this line, there's a number of lines you can actually use to get the vacuum source from. The most common on the TT is to take a T-fitting and install it right after your fuel pressure regulator. That's the little silver bung that's right here. You can simply cut the vacuum line coming off of it and install the T-fitting. One side note is this line that comes off of the fuel pressure regulator is made out of brittle braided vacuum hose. Now's a good time to update that to silicone if you have it. From here, the easiest way I've found to route it is to go up the engine bay, across the chassis support brace, and into the cabin air filter area. When you take the cabin air filter out, in the back of the area you'll see a little black plastic bung which you're going to need to push through with a screwdriver and route the tubing through. Where does this come out, you might ask? Well, it comes out behind the glove box and easily routes down to this area for the boost gauge. If you're mounting your boost gauge somewhere else, there's probably an easier way to route it, but this works great for our purposes. The glove box is actually incredibly easy to remove. It's held on with 7 or 8 Torx screws, which you can remove in any order. These screws are in 3 different places, some of which are on the bottom of the glove box, some of which are behind the panel, and then the rest are actually inside on the roof of the glove box. It simply pops in and out of place. Before yanking it out completely, make sure to remove the wiring harness that's in there. Here's what is behind there, and you'll be able to see the bung and the routing that I use to get the vacuum hose into the cabin. The only difference with yours is there won't be a hose there until you push the little bung through and shove the hose in. You could use this bung for an air vent pod as well, but you might have to route it a little bit differently when you get inside the cabin. I'm not going to be swapping out the hose because I know that this one works just fine. I just wanted to show an easy way to route it. Now we can button back up the glove box, which is as simple as reinstalling all of those screws you removed earlier. Now it's time to do something that I've been getting weirdly emotional about. We're going to remove the boost gauge that's on the car currently. I have a lot of history with this car now, and this was the first thing I did with it. It's kind of a weird feeling to replace your old work with something better after your skills have improved. There's absolutely nothing wrong with this Harbor Freight boost gauge, and I'm definitely going to keep it on hand in case I need another one. The boost gauge was the first thing I did to this car, and when I look at the new setup, all I'm going to be thinking about is how much I've done to the car in total, how far it's come, and I think that's pretty cool.
That crappy boost gauge, as bad as it was the very first thing I did to this car when I bought it. I think this is a really good step for the car going forward. I've come a long way with this car, and this is kind of bittersweet in a weird way. Maybe you guys can relate somehow.
My goal with mounting and picking this gauge pod specifically was to follow the design language of the TT. Everything in this interior is nearly symmetrical down to the defrost vents running the front of the car, which connect to your air vents, down to even the climate controls. I want this car to be a TT still. I think part of what makes the TT special is its unique design charm. Putting this dual gauge pod in the ashtray follows the design pattern of the car and accomplishes our goal of mounting a boost gauge in something that's not zip ties. And I don't use the ashtray, so we're not losing any functionality doing this. It's also super easy to remove since there's only one Torx bit holding it in place, and some electrical harnesses. When I removed the Torx bit and the electrical harnesses, I could slide out the ashtray. This is what it looks like when your ashtray is removed, and there's a lot of room for activities down there. I wonder what else we could hide in there.
Moment of truth time. We're gonna see if this gamble will actually work, because we didn't buy this for the Mark 1 TT. That part has been discontinued for years now. This is for an 8P A3, which is, I think, the next generation of A3 from when the TT came out, which ironically has a very similar cavity in its center console when you remove the ashtray as well. So hopefully it fits okay.
Since this isn't designed for the car, there's no way to mount it from the factory. I'm gonna have to figure out not only how to mount it, but how I want it to sit and what I think looks best. But at first glance, it is really promising. I decided to run some wires through to see what it would look like with the gauge in it, and I'm starting to really like this idea. I think this is gonna look pretty great. For the time being, and while I'm adjusting it, I decided to use 3M tape to hold it in place and temporarily fix it to the car. You might be wondering, what am I going to put in the other gauge pod? And that is a great question. I'm most likely going to get a wideband AFR gauge, which will be very useful when we end up swapping turbos. But for now, I put an old boost gauge in there so I could see what it would look like with something in it, and so that there wasn't just a hole in the interior. I also went ahead and hooked up the silicone tube that we ran from the engine to the new gauge. Before we really see what the boost gauges look like, we need to power it, and I'm going to go over how I best power these. The next thing you're going to need to do is remove the cover underneath the steering wheel, which is even easier than removing the glove box since there's only 3 Torx bits. Boost gauges will generally have a different number of wires depending on what kind of functions they have. You're going to want to consult your instructions to see what the actual wires are supposed to be connected to. No matter how many you have, I suggest you disconnect the battery anytime you do anything with wires. You're generally going to have a ground wire and a few power wires that need to go to different sources. Mine happens to have 4, but we can simplify this a little bit. These wires need an ignition-controlled power source. That means one that only has power when the key is in the car. If you have an aftermarket radio, it's likely already wired to one of these sources. One of these wires is actually supposed to go to the headlight dimmer, but I don't think I really need that functionality, so I decided to also wire it to the ignition controlled power. There are 4 different bolts under the TT that supply different forms of power. This is where we're going to be grabbing the power from rather than cutting into a wire and splicing it all janky like. When doing stuff like this, I always suggest using ring terminals since they greatly improve the look of your wiring. Like I said earlier, these 2 wires need ignition controlled power, and on the TT, the ignition controlled power is the bolt with the yellow marking. Wiring seems pretty complicated, but if you take it one step at a time, it's not really that bad. Once I crimped the wire onto the end terminal, I could slide it into the power source, and then bolt it all back up. Two wires down, 2 to go. The next one we're looking for is constant 12-volt power. This is actually the terminal in red right next to the ignition controlled power. If your boost gauge just has one power wire, make sure you wire it to the ignition controlled power, otherwise it's constantly going to be on even when your key's not in the car. The only reason this boost gauge connects to constant 12-volt power is so that it can remember what color it's set to after you shut the car off. Do the right thing, disconnect your battery so that you don't have to worry about getting shocked when you play with these wires. The last wire is your ground terminal, which is the easiest to install. You can get it to work with some raw metal in the car, or if you want to be safe, just mount it to this brown bung right here.
So in theory, we should be able to put the key in the ignition and the light should come on. The constant power is so that it can remember the color. The orange is for your headlight dimmer if you want to worry about the brightness. I'm going to see how bright it is and then we'll do the dimmer if we need to. I went ahead and tested a few things. I made sure things still worked when you started the car up. Sometimes you can draw too much voltage and it'll cause a problem. We should be good to button the car back up and make it look all pretty.
This boost gauge has been a long time coming, and it means a lot to me to be able to look down in the car and see something that I'm proud of. Another thing on my bucket list for the TT is refinishing the headlights, which are pretty oxidized at this point. I'm going to polish them and coat them in a headlight sealant, which will protect them from a lot of UV rays. This won't be a perfect fix, but it is going to look a ton better than it did. I wet sand with 1000 grit, then 2000 grit, and then 3000 grit, progressively getting finer until the headlights are nice and smooth. Then I use a polisher to make them even shinier. And finally, I coat them in a sealant which protects them from UV rays. You can get kits to do this at almost any auto parts store, and it honestly makes a huge difference for your car. Now it's time to do the other side. I tested the boost gauge's electronics, so now I wanted to test the actual boost gauge itself and make sure that the readings were good. It looks like the gauge is reading accurately, so here is the final look at what this boost gauge and my installation method looks like. I am ecstatic about how the new gauge looks in the car, especially with the gamble we took fitting a part that's not even meant for the car. It continues the unique design of the TT's interior, along with providing the additional functionality that having the gauges does. If you like the look of this, I highly recommend you install something similar on your TT. As of now, it's my favorite interior mod that I've done to the car. I want to thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, learned something, or want to see me continue building these cars, consider consider dropping a like and subscribing for more. I'm gonna have project cars my entire life, and I'm gonna be documenting them all here. The support that you guys have been giving me is absolutely unreal, and it makes me so happy to see that you all are enjoying the videos as much as I am making them. Seriously, thank you for your time of day.